So I guess we'll get started. Couple of housekeeping issues before we get into things. I am out of town next week, and Michael will be in for Ask a Theologian, Ask a Pastor, with Pastor Ben, and so that's what he's passing out, questions there. The great opportunity you have right here, apparently, is that you can write down a question anonymously. So, you want to get those questions that, don't reflect badly on you in some way or embarrass you. You can put them down. Otherwise, next week, he'll know who's asking. So there's that. Also, another little housekeeping issue. After class last week, Roger Barnett came up and asked where I got the Buechner quote. And I thought, gosh, historians of all people ought to provide footnotes or references or something. I was a little professionally embarrassed that I didn't have that. But okay, so it's up there now if you're curious. That's the quote from Buechner and from Wishful Thinking, a theological ABC. And I do want to say that really excellent comments and questions from you last week. Towards the end, you really do bring a wealth of knowledge and insight and perspective, and I think we could have spent, a half hour on every question that was and comment that was brought up last week. And so thank you for all of you with different sort of comments. I want to build on something that Edith had said, and I may be misremembering or misunderstanding exactly what she's saying, but I was thinking a lot about some of her comment this week, and I don't know if my response to her last week got to the core of her question, but if I'm recalling her question correctly, Edith may have been suggesting, maybe with regard to lust, that we have been focusing so much on the don'ts without really giving a very good sense of what it is that is good and right, or maybe a positive program. And I think she's right about that. And it made me think also more about this question of dealing with vices and virtues and the problem of maybe spending too much time. I don't know if there's a balance to find on the vice side versus the virtue side. I don't know. But I want to point out, with all that in mind, I do want to point out a particular kind of virtue that gets developed in this Westminster class and in other classes like this. Things that we do Sunday morning or in certain kinds of Bible studies and other classes. And what we do plays right into one of the key cardinal virtues historically, which is prudence or practical wisdom. And I like C.S. Lewis as a good shorthand definition of prudence or practical wisdom. Prudence means taking the trouble to think out what you are doing and what is likely to come of it. And it's really kind of amazing when you think about it, about how often in our culture we just don't think through the implications of things we do every day and what is likely to come up, partly for a lot of different reasons, I think. But one of the problems is to take the trouble. It takes some effort to do it. But what happens in here, you see then, is actually a virtue. It is that process of becoming more like Christ. And I think it's a particular kinds of means of grace when we have these discussions and you raise these questions and give your insights and your comments here. That is a process. That is part of the process of becoming more Christ-like. What goes on when we have these discussions. And I do believe that it's better when we do this collectively, in discussion and in conversation with one another, and also, this is how historians often think, in conversation with people from the past. You use the Hebrews reference, the great cloud of witnesses, Augustine and Aquinas and Gregory of Nyssa and C.S. Lewis and Frederick Buechner and so forth. All these, when you were in discussion with them, and there's a great benefit to that. So anyway, great. I love your comments, and I think it's very important in terms of under pragmatic, practical wisdom, and then as we get an understanding from that, we can better move on into other sort of areas where we can develop virtue or become more Christ-like in our lives. And I do want to say this also. I think another reason why it's important to get comments from you is that I have limitations, and I don't know everything, and it's important that I get comments from the rest of you. I mean, sometimes I'm just flat out wrong in what I say. So there's that. And I also do have a lot of questions. I'm actually not a philosopher or a theologian where we're drawing from this, although as a historian I'm working on a project where I've been diving into this in the last couple of years. But I still have a lot of questions. And so that's part of my limitation, but it's also an opportunity to hear from all of you. So I have questions like today, the vice is gluttony. And here's a vice that probably doesn't strike fear in our hearts, and we maybe have to ask, at least I do, does this really count as a serious vice? Is it a capital vice? And let me give you just a little teaser here. Before we go deeper, I want to get a little bit broader. When I first started reading about gluttony, I assumed it meant overeating, and that's gluttony. But theologians who thought deeply about this have included other aspects of eating, and for instance, picky eating, a very particular way about how you eat and how it should be paired and insisting it should be, that's gluttony. And there are a lot of very thin people out there who are trapped by the vice of gluttony. There are more dimensions to this than what first meets the eye. So that's my little teaser for what's going to happen. But I think to start, it might be helpful to compare the vice of gluttony to the vice of lust, which we talked about last week. Because in some ways it seems like these are on opposite sides of the spectrum. I mean, Christians in America today spend a lot of time worrying about sexuality and sexual sins. We don't pay much attention to gluttony. We don't feel we have a need to pay attention to gluttony. I mean, can you think of any Christian leaders who ever got caught in a scandal over gluttony? Sneaking down to the Golden Corral and eating way too much. I know, what would that look like? I don't know. There are many Christians today who are very worried about what their children watch in movies or on TV. How often do they say, stay away from that show? It has too much overeating in it. They eat food in a sinful way. But issues of sexuality are dividing denominations. I can't think of a serious church conflict in American history that was done over how food is eaten. Sexual issues, and as John very poignantly pointed out last week, bring shame to us. The shame of gluttony is minimal. There are certain types of shame. We sometimes shame people who are overweight, but otherwise it's not even recognized, other forms of gluttony. And yet, the great theologians said that gluttony and lust are very closely related. And the reason is because, by the way, there's another sidelight to think about religious faith. The Jewish law pays a lot of attention to food, and how food is prepared, and how food is eaten, and so does Islam, but other religions do too. Hinduism, there's certain forms of Hinduism where vegetarianism is very, very important. Jainism, is what you eat or don't eat, is very, very important. I mean, and in other cultures around the world, the traditional local religions oftentimes, food somehow seems really very, very important, has a deep ethical component to it. And so why do the theologians say that actually lust and gluttony are so closely related? And there's a number of reasons. One of them is that both of them, the excessiveness of both, takes something that is designed for more than pleasure, and the vice makes it only about pleasure. Both sins actually start in weakness in many instances. They are in many ways. Both try to satisfy a spiritual longing with a physical act. I mean, if we were mere animals, then bodily pleasures would satisfy us. But we are humans, which means we are created for more, and we are created for more in both sex and in eating. And so they're both a distortion of something that really is very, very good. And the pleasure in both is a gift from God. Food, as is in lust, the more we actually focus on the pleasure in the long run and make pleasure our top or our only goal, the more likely it is that it will be less and less satisfying. And so there's this issue of the problem of self-gratification. Now, the Bible does actually mention, well, actually, if you really start to look at it, food is just interwoven in the Bible all over the place. Very, very, so much so that I think it's, a lot of times for me, I'm just not even conscious of it. It just seems so, that's the Bible. It's ordinary. That's how it goes. But a place where maybe you get a very direct point to food as a vice, we can find in Philippians 3, verses 18 to 21. For many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. I have often told you of them, and now I tell you even with tears. Their end is destruction, their God is their belly. And their glory is in the shame. In their shame, their minds are set on earthly things, but our citizenship is in heaven, and it's from there that we are expecting a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. He will transform the body of our humiliation that it may be conformed to the body of his glory, and by the power that also enables him to make all things subject to himself. Their God is their body, or their belly, sorry. Their God, their God is the belly. I think we can see that deep desire to say this is I'm just really driven by this. Now, even with that, I still have a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to gluttony, but this comparison, this link, the close cousins, as theologians say, of lust, sorry, not sex, but lust, well, I guess sex and food maybe in some ways, lust and gluttony, it makes me wonder, in our culture today, are we culturally too obsessed with sexual issues and not enough about gluttony? Is that the way to think about it? Or is there a different way to think about it? And I don't know exactly, but here's, I think, one way to frame it. I'll get to that. I'll get to that pretty much. But here's the background to this. If you think about food, eating, of course, is something we do every single day. It is one of the most basic needs we have as human beings. Our habits with food are constant and immediate and tangible. And of course, as I mentioned, eating is a good thing. It gives us pleasure. It gives me a great deal of pleasure. I can tell you that. And Aquinas said that the more natural and necessary an activity, the more God put pleasure in it. We do need to enjoy the things that God gave us to enjoy. So here's the framing part then, maybe a way to think about food and eating. The potential for disordering our desires in food into a vice is constant and immediate and tangible. But the potential for ordering our desires with the help of God, by the grace of God, with food into a virtue is also constant immediate and tangible. There's something about eating that's almost like the little Lego blocks of the building, right? It's happened so often and regularly, and how we do it is. I think that's part of the reason why it's considered a capital vice. Is that, and I think probably tied to many virtues. Now, as I hinted at earlier, there's more than one kind of gluttony. There's several dimensions to it. In the medieval age, the phrase was gluttony is eating too daintily, too sumptuously, too hastily, too greedily, too much. Okay, so a modern way of putting this is with an acronym, because for some reason, as moderns, we like acronyms. FRESH, which I don't know that fresh has, I guess there's fresh food, but I don't know. This is a vice. I don't know how it fits. But fastidiously, ravenously, excessively, sumptuously, hastily. These are different ways we can eat that can turn our eating habit patterns into vices. We're going to look at these briefly. We're going to start, though, with the E. Sorry, for those of you that love acronyms, my acronym this morning will be IFRS. We're starting with E because that's the one that we think of the most, and I think I'm assuming is maybe the clearest. Eating excessively. And that's what, for a long time, I thought, that's what gluttony is only, and it is that, overeating. And, of course, what happens there is that you are eating past fullness, right? You don't have to go past fullness to be satisfied or to be content. And that's not the purpose of eating, is to stuff yourself all the time. But I face a constant temptation to have one more piece of pizza even though I'm full. Pizza in particular. Although I can do it with a lot of other kinds of foods too, of course. Just eat excessively, and I know in my head this is too much. I'm going to regret this later for a lot of different reasons. But why? Why? And you go on for going for that pleasure. And I think we understand that, and I think that this is what most people think about gluttony, and maybe in our minds we assume that we can look at somebody and say, yeah, they've got a problem with eating, and that's gluttony. Although you can't always. I mean, there may be a bunch of other reasons, factors involved. Number one, in somebody that maybe looks overweight to us, and also, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people who are not overweight at all who have a problem with gluttony. And that brings me to the F, fastidiously. This is the picky eaters. It's for the picky eaters out there. A certain kind of picky eater. There's, I think, a sense of wanting to control things in a particular sort of way that comes out in eating. This comes up, I think, maybe best explained from a passage from Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. If you know Screwtape Letters, it's written from the point of view of some demons who are trying to capture the soul of, people and lead them away from Christ. And woven through Screwtape Letters are questions of virtues and vices. And there is one point at which they are talking about a particular woman and about how to get to her, and they're going with a new strategy, and the strategy is the glutton of delicacy. And this is what they're building on her. She is a positive terror to hostesses and servants. She is always turning from what has been offered to her to say with a demure little sigh and a smile, "Oh, please, please, all I want is a cup of tea. Weak, but not too weak. And the teensiest bit of really crisp toast." You see? Because what she wants is smaller and less costly than what has been set before her, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. And in fact, there's an allusion here to her God is her belly in the passage. Lewis is alluding to Philippians. Her belly dominates her whole life, even though it's eating just a little bit, but has to be a particular sort of way. I've talked with college students. One of my classes, we talk about job and vocation and so forth, and sometimes I ask them, what's the worst job you ever had? And a lot of times they'll bring up, they're college students, they haven't been in, a lot of times it's part-time jobs, and they bring up food service. And some of them will say, man, some of the customers you face are just really, really difficult. I remember one young woman I think she worked like one of those ice cream stands that also sold hamburgers and hot dogs. It was a fairly big, it had a drive-up window, and they said that there was one woman who would come regularly, drive up, and be so demanding about a particular kind of hot dog and a particular kind of stuff on the hot dog. She would often send it back and get it and send it back and demand. Doesn't matter if the line is backing up behind her in the drive-through and the workers are all busy. She has no concept that they're busy and running around and doing all kinds of things. And she just creates all kinds of problems for other customers and the staff because the hot dog has to be so exactly perfectly right. I also find it interesting that was a hot dog for some reason. But, it can be, we can be fastidious about all kinds of things, right? That's a form of gluttony, which is going to be, I think, as I'm going to show in a minute, deeply related to another form, that desire. There's pleasure in, I think, part of the way I see this, there's pleasure in not just having it right, not so much even a lot of times for the taste of it, but because you just want things set up a particular way, your way. There's kind of a power control issue that's tied into this. Then there's ravenously. This is greedy eating. I think, I'll come back to this. I do wonder whether things have changed in our culture today in the modern world when it comes to food in a way that we eat differently, or maybe there are certain kinds of gluttony that are more of a problem for us today than there were before. But ravenously is greedy eating, and it can come a lot of ways. One version is that when a food is in short supply, and I say this because that's not a problem that particular side of it is not a problem we today really face. But there are all kinds of cultures and societies where sometimes food is in short supply, either through famine or there are times when a city is under siege. And part of the idea of under siege is, you get this in biblical times, right? That over months and months and months and months, food can't get in, and eventually the people are going to starve. It'll hit everybody of all classes, no matter how wealthy you are. Kind of like, even though the wealthy can maybe pay for the last little bit of food, they're hit. Kind of like the pandemic, COVID. It just didn't seem to know any class barriers, even though there were healthcare access. There were some class dimensions to that. But it's the idea that you want to grab something before it runs out. Was one form of being ravenous. You want to have it. You just got to have it for yourself. Or maybe there's this fear. We had a dog like this. I think she was abused. We picked her up at the Humane Society. I think it was, I don't know, theology of animals. I'm not sure how to face it. Anyway, the human abuse of her. Every time she ate, she just had to wolf it down because she was worried. You could tell she was worried something else would come in and maybe grab it. Or, and I have a suspicion that this is less common today than even when we were younger, but it's when you're eating with other people, there's a sense that, the thing I really want will get eaten up first. So, potluck or carry-in dinners, what do you say at this church or in this place? Potluck? Even though you're Calvinists? Okay. I thought we believed in God's sovereignty, but okay, potlucks. We'll go with potlucks. Sorry, it's an old theological joke. They're going through the line, and it's like, oh, deviled eggs. I got to get a couple because, they might be gone if I want to come back up here again. A couple, we have college students over to our house every now and then, and a couple of weeks ago we had some college leaders, a few of them over for dinner. Wonderful people. I mean, really. I mean, these were great, caring students who love community and care about other people. I'd made a chicken pasta salad, and as we were passing it around, you see some students like picking out the chicken. I went to another place, and there was a young woman who was digging through there and getting the tomatoes and the cucumbers out. Oh, got to get the vegetables. She said, well, I think they just are not thinking that, well, so then, who's at the end of, when this bowl is going around the table at the end, where's the chicken or the tomatoes, or the balance is all off. You're not thinking about how your actions are affecting other people. So that's one way that can play out. Hastily, one version of this, I guess, is kids just shoveling food into their mouth without thinking and really not valuing or appreciating the food as a real gift from God in some way. I don't know if this fits or not, but I had another thought that in our modern Western American task-oriented society, we approach food oftentimes too hastily. Well, shoot, we have a category, right? Fast food. This hit to me when I was in Kenya. I don't know if I've said this before, but I'll mention this. When after Elisa and I graduated from college, we went to Kenya for 6 years. Taught at a school, boarding school. We were missionaries at a boarding school, mostly missionary kids. So anyway, living in Africa for 6 years did all kinds of things to us. But I remember our very first year there, we came around to Thanksgiving. It's Kenya, they don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but it was an American-based school and American curriculum, and most of our students were American, although a number of them were from Europe and many places in Africa and Korea and so forth. But we had some friends who invited us over at night after school for a Thanksgiving dinner. And they also had invited an African pastor who had spent some time in the United States a few years, so he knew about Thanksgiving. So I remember we were gathered around as the table's we're about ready to eat, and I'm trying to strike up conversation with this Kenyan pastor I had never met before, and I said, I really like Thanksgiving. It's eating, and you get to bring people together. It's really good, to have a bunch of people together when you eat. And he kind of nodded, and I realized afterwards that saying, it's good to, have people over for a meal was kind of like saying it's good to eat every day. In his mind, it's like, duh, yeah, because it seems like every time that Kenyans ate, they ate together. It was a communal, this is how you eat, a regular practice of things. And then we got talking more, about, in America, we don't often do this, and then he started laughing about drive-up windows. Oh, drive up windows. He says, yeah, like what? This is just like, you could see how weird this was to him when he came to America. You drive your car, you come up to the store, they give you the food. Now you have this food, you're in your car, and now you're driving down the road, eating and trying to drive at the same time, and the food's getting all over you. I mean, to him, it was just absurd. One of those first moments when I was suddenly in Kenya looking back on myself and my own culture and saying, yeah, that is kind of weird, isn't it? That happened a lot. But I think as I thought about this later, I realized that it goes to we prioritize getting tasks done, and we're very individualistic. It's very hard for us to stop and slow down and eat with other people. I'm still far too guilty, too often. I mean, sometimes you have to eat it quickly and on the run, but, I eat at my desk sometimes, maybe too often, instead of just slowing down with people. It's not so much food, it's the, I've got this desire to get the food and not really appreciating the food itself and the other people as a regular part of life. I don't know if that fits or not, but it seemed to me there's something there. And then there is sumptuously. This is very similar to eating fastidiously. Sumptuously if I understand it fully, is that is preoccupation with what is eaten, and you have to have the really, really good food in some way. And I think historically it was like the really, really, what I want to say, luxurious food, expensive food. You have to have that. Although I think in our day and age, just about all of us can have, well, I'll get to that in a moment. But I think maybe one way to think about it is there's a danger for those of us who are foodies. I think there's some people just, right, we know this, taste better, have more highly refined taste buds, and really can make distinctions in terms of how things are prepared and cooked, and really get into and enjoy food. And I think there's something really good about that. These are the kinds of people who make good chefs, to produce really, really, because they can just pick out how things are going and how things are made and what makes for really, really good food. The danger there, though, is to expect and want that every single time you eat. And the problem is that, oddly enough, it can make you very dissatisfied because sometimes it's not going to be as good. Or sometimes you have to eat something that isn't really, really good. Or what happens when you're with other people and you have to decide, well, what restaurant do we want to go to? And if you're a foodie, you're like, I really, really want to go to this restaurant, which I think is fine. But are we willing to say, but no, you want to go to this other restaurant, the food isn't very good, maybe they have hot dogs that you really like. Okay, we'll go there, and can I be content and satisfied with that? I have a friend who I eat lunch with regularly, and when I was doing this a couple years ago, I mentioned that to him. And he's really very, very much a foodie. And he was like, yeah, you're right. And ever since then, he said, I've made it a practice. And here's the thing I think about how sometimes just being aware of vices can be helpful. He's made it a practice that even though there's certain kinds of food that he really, really likes and really enjoys, I'm going to be okay if it's not that great. And I'm going to be okay and I noticed once after this when we were trying to decide where to go, he says, just pick anywhere. It's okay. And he was, making this point. It's a type of how it affects how we relate with one another. Now, how big is the danger? Again, I don't know about gluttony overall. I'm still not exactly sure what to think about it, but I think there are reasons to consider it as, rightfully so, as a capital vice, one of which is, who am I to argue with Aquinas and Augustine and so forth? But do I understand it? I'm not sure, but it has provoked my thinking as a historian in a couple of different ways. And let me go back to this. And I do wonder whether we engage food differently than we did in previous centuries, simply because we live in a time of incredible prosperity. Now, human nature is the same. I think gluttony will still be a problem until Christ comes again. It's a phrase I've never said before. Gluttony will be a problem until Christ comes again. But the conditions around which we engage food is different. So here's one thought I have. All of us have the resources and the opportunities to pretty much eat anything we want, anytime we want. For the most part. I mean, unless we're foodies who really have to have the 5-star Michelin restaurant sort of thing. But in general, we have so many opportunities with food, so many choices, so many opportunities. We don't have to be a king. We don't have to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company to be in this sort of situation. When Elise and I lived in Kenya, we had enough food to eat. We didn't ever go hungry. But there were certain American foods that we longed for that we couldn't get in Kenya. Big Macs, strangely. Oreo cookies, Lucky Charms. Lisa liked the Lucky Charms. Good pepperoni pizza. that sort of stuff. And when we came back, it was like, oh, look at this food. And now in America, it's like these things are just like, well, yeah, you can have it anytime you want to. Do I really appreciate pepperoni pizza when I want to? And does it affect my, like, okay, the Big Mac won't do it anymore. Now I've got to go to this other great hamburger. Or wait a minute, now I need to go to steak. Now I need to go to certain kinds of steak to get the law of diminishing returns, simply because the opportunity is all around us and we have the money to do it. And the other thing I wondered about, our prosperity extends far beyond food, of course, and so do the things and the opportunities and resources we have for pleasure. Let's just take entertainment. We have the opportunities and the resources to be entertained by just about anything we want, anytime we want. Cable TV alone, right, caters to a mind-boggling arrays of individual interests and pleasures: sports, home and garden, food, romance, music, nature, history, sort of, pets. And you have, right, the stereotypical male football fanatic who spends all weekend locked into watching football on TV from Friday night, maybe high school games, or now there are college games on Friday night. And you've got, right, even different when we were growing up when, I don't know, football fans, do you remember this? Right, there was one NFL game of the week and you didn't even have highlights. But now you can have games all the time, everywhere, and you can spend all this. And so you can see people who, this is common in culture, the guy who ignores his family, or right, football widows. Do we talk about that? It's like I'm not going to see my husband all weekend because he's spending so much time with football. There's some sort of vice there. Is the pleasure for entertainment made up as the same stuff as the pleasure with food and gluttony? And if so, then maybe the virtues we need to use to go at that would be similar. I don't know. But it strikes me that Augustine would not even be able to imagine all the opportunities, this world we live in, where, and that was just cable TV, of course. You can go on to all kinds of other sort of ways we can spend our time and be driven by pleasure. And it seems like we need a good, virtuous approach towards things like entertainment that appreciates what is good, right, of it in what way, without maybe, I don't know if these similar sort of things apply to entertainment or other things like that or not. However, there does seem to be a connection. So consider this. Next week in worship, the choir will be singing a spiritual, Poor Man Lazarus. Look for that. I won't be here, but I feel kind of bad that I won't be here because I really would like to hear it. But choir will be singing that. It's based, of course, on the parable in Luke 16, which is in the lectionary, and it's worth reading, or at least part of it. Right? This is the parable. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man who died was carried away to be with the angels, to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. The parable goes on. I think you know the rest of it. If you don't, well, it doesn't end well for the rich man, I'll say that. But I want to point out that you have, what caught me was, in this version, and this is the NRSV, that he feasted sumptuously. Suddenly there's that word, sumptuously, in there, tied to food. And I was looking at other translations, and other translations don't necessarily have feasted or food in there. And I thought, okay, so what is going on here? So I contacted my friend, who is my friend T.C. Hom at Malone, who's an expert in biblical languages. I think everybody should have a friend who's an expert in biblical languages. It's a very great thing if you can pull it off. And I asked him about this, and he said there's an adverbial phrase here in Greek not found elsewhere in the New Testament. And he says the core of the word usually means to make merry, but if you add the adverb, you have a word with a close connotation to feasting in common Greek. And so some translations just said he lived in luxury, and others add the food part. And he thought that some translations don't have feasting sumptuously because they want to be more literal, or they want to make the language easier to understand. But in a more, sometimes more scholarly reading, you'd have that word sumptuously in there regarding food. Now, this is about greed too, right? You've got the fine linen, the purple cloth. He's a rich man. But it's interesting that food is brought in there at the same time. And of course, what you have here are habits. He feasted every day. And here's our habit. We do eat every day. And we, more so than I think people from 2,000 years ago, have to make all kinds of economic decisions every day. Because we have a lot, quite frankly, we have a lot of money to decide what to do with. And in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, of course, this man has been so habituated towards satisfying his own desires that he does not care about poor Lazarus. And he does not, who longs for just, the crumbs from his table. So that's maybe a warning to us, but there's also an opportunity to us, because we have the opportunity, and I think maybe the calling, to use our resources to really carry out God's purposes and bless the world and become more like Christ in the process. And maybe even our approach to food is a part of that. Because maybe our approach to food, his approach to pleasure, is also tied to there is a link here to greed, which is another vice, I think, although there's a lot of dimensions to greed. But how do we use our resources? Daily virtues in approaching food. There are spiritual disciplines that a lot of people have written about regarding food. Actually, spiritual discipline, maybe the better way to say it is there are spiritual disciplines that are regarding how to become more Christ-like, and they involve food. So, fasting and feasting, good feasting, and good fasting. Matthew 6, Jesus says, when you fast, he assumes we will fast, although there's no law that commands that we fast. I don't know how many American Christians assume that we would fast regularly. Eastern Orthodox do. Some Catholic groups today, the Catholics used to fast more often or more regularly or emphasize it more than what they do. But fasting, I think, is a very good discipline to handle all of those aspects of gluttony that we face. Richard Foster said in his Celebration of Discipline, said that fasting reveals the things that control us or might control us. And so here's an opportunity to become more like Christ and strengthen us spiritually. Another aspect of food, right? When Jesus began his ministry, he went into the wilderness and fasted for 40 days. And we often talk about the temptation that Jesus faced. And temptation can mean, right, something that will entice me to sin or do evil. But the Greek word for temptation also can mean a test or a challenge. Here's a test, here's a challenge. And so that seems to also fit what was happening with Jesus in the wilderness. This was not the last temptation Jesus faced, but fasting in some ways was a test. Are you going to be molded with the will of the Father? And so good fasting can increase our appetite for the things of God. I say this for somebody who has fasted before, but I do not do it as regularly as I can. Maybe many of you do regularly, or you do it at Lent. Lent is a good time to do a type of fasting, give up certain sort of things that you really, really desire. And then suddenly, as Richard Foster says, you see how things control you when that happens. But I want to mention one other thing. After Jesus fasted in the wilderness, came out of the wilderness, John the Baptist met him, he got baptized, and then one of the first things that Jesus did after that, his first miracle, the wedding at Cana, a feast, turning water into wine, an abundance of wine, more wine than anybody could drink. Aquinas said, excessive fasting is a vice. You can go too far the other way. Maybe there's a certain fastidiousness that comes with that. So I think good feasting can be done as a virtue also, if done properly. I think you have to pair it with fasting. Maybe Americans are hoping we can just feast every single day, and then we're kind of like on the wrong side of the parable there with Lazarus. But to eat and to celebrate in community with more than pleasure in mind, with celebrating the good gifts that God has done for us, or us coming through a challenge, or meeting with community and enjoying one another, even the people that we don't like, we can enjoy them. Maybe we can at least love them as we sit down and eat with them in several ways. So, let me conclude by going back to, wait a minute. Yes, this is the end of that verse from Philippians where we talked about the God is our belly. And by the way, I should have had the whole thing up here, but Paul starts with saying they are enemies of Christ. and of course there was a list of things, but the God, their belly is their God, was part of it. But here's the other good news for us. Our citizenship is in heaven, and it is from there that we are expecting a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. He will transform the body of our humiliation, or some translations say our humble bodies. Our humble bodies will be transformed so that it may be conformed to the body of His glory. This glorified body. This is where we should be heading, union with Christ, by the power that also enables Him to make all things subject to Himself. So, I would say with food, there's also this great opportunity for us daily to have certain habits. Sometimes it may just be being aware of them. Sometimes it's maybe a bigger battle, the challenge in the wilderness. But it's towards this goal. This wonderful goal to become more like Christ and be more glorified, which includes food being used for its proper purposes. All right, comments, questions, observations, insights, anything? Yes?
By the economic value. You know, I could think the other day, I was thinking about, I seen this one person was obese, and they had a tattoo, and they thought that tattoo really made their appearance great. You know, there's a lot of money to be made in tattoos. If there wasn't money made, we wouldn't have all those. And that's true of every one of these disciplines. There's so much money to be made in all these things.
There is, yes, and that's a very, very good point. You know, I think Americans spend more money, I read this somewhere, more money on dieting than we do actually on food. You can make a lot of money on dieting because there's a recognition maybe that we're abusing food, but sometimes it's just I want to look good or want to maybe be healthy, which maybe those are fine, but it's that can be a kind of excessive fast. But you're right, there's this that's tied into, that's a very, very good point. There's so much money that can be made in a lot of this sort of stuff. Yes?
Well, I think our comments about lust have gotten focused on the wrong thing. Don't we lust after wealth and everything else too? It comes back to where we seem to put our focus, sexuality. And the other thing is, Jesus focuses on food as saying that He is the bread of life. He's born in a manger, manger, and communion. Isn't He redirecting that desire or lust for food into desire for God.
Yes,
and
that's
the
an
need.
excellent point. What we were made for. What we were made for. And it's interesting, yeah, how the food comes, communion. By the way, eating together, communion. There's something there, right? The bread, we take this bread, take this wine. It seems to be more than a symbol, but it is directing us spiritually towards who we are supposed to be, who God made us to be. That's a great point, because it's just woven through all of it, isn't it? Thank you, Sue.
Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like an underlying common denominator to much of what you've spoken about the last 2 weeks is self-indulgence.
No, I think that's a good point. I think that is right. These two vices in particular are vices. Now, other vices. No. Let me put it this way. I think what Augustine and Aquinas and Gregory of Nyssa would say is that specifically these two vices are towards self-indulgent and self-gratification. But one thing that underlines all the vices is pride. The idea that I myself am the best judge of what is good for me and how I'm going to be fulfilled or happy or what I want, without recognizing God. So I think you're right. I do think you're exactly right on this. Yes?
Your comment about COVID made me segue into how gluttony affects all kinds of resource allocations. So I know that the U.S. was very gluttonous in our capture of most of the COVID vaccine for the world, which then caused health professionals in Turkey to not be vaccinated as they headed into the rooms of the COVID patients. And I think about the war in the Ukraine and how Putin has become so gluttonous in trying to control and capture resources that are so valuable that are in the Ukraine. So it led me far beyond the eating. But I also have experienced, because of my profession, the eating that of both errors of the spectrum, both the anorexic patient who had induced herself to vomit so much that she became septic and was in the ICU because she had infection in her larynx, and then the opposite, the 400, 500, 600 patient who is now killing themselves, their joints and their other organs because of the excessive use of food. But I thought far beyond the resources of just food when I'm thinking about resources and allocation.
Yeah. There's a number of things there. Yeah, and that's a whole other area with anorexia, or that's. Am I correct, right, that anorexia is a particularly modern kind of thing? I think I've heard that this is something that has developed over the last 50 years. That particular combination. I mean, you had people before who fasted excessively, I guess, but they say these particular, I don't know. Anyway, that's a very, very good point too. And I also love your point. This does actually lead us to this question of allocation of resources. You're right. How are we using the money and resources that we have? And there's great opportunity, and I say this, for us to say, wait a minute, I can do really good things with what I have. So, yes, Edith.
So, in addition to what Beth is saying, back in the 70s, I read a book called Rich Christians in the Age of Hunger. And that has really shaped me in a lot of ways in terms of that sense of resources and our arrogance in the West of, God has given the world resources that if we were generous with one another, if we appreciated as Christians that God is my source, that I would not cling so desperately to food while other people are starving, or, medical resources when other people are dying, that, we're generous with our weapons, but we're not generous with our other things. And so Whether that's individually, that I eat too much in one meal, or that I insist that, I have raspberries in February, and my understanding that, quinoa, our new fad food, that the people of Peru are now lacking quinoa because it's all being
dear.
shipped to the United States. They can make more money. And so they are deficient in their own crop. And so to me, those are things that as Christians, when we say, do I have the heart of Christ, that this is a very practical expression of, do I love my neighbor as I myself?
Yeah, and suddenly the problems of gluttony are we're starting to see more and more serious problems with it, which then also means that the things we do good, the things we do that are Christ-like, just as, I don't know, what's the equivalent of the good we can do with that in terms of how do we use so the awareness, how do we become aware? Maybe we need a constant, regular practice that keeps us aware. And what am I going to do with my resources? Suddenly there are all these cascading connections, aren't there? Yeah. This will be related to the vice of avarice, or greed, which has several different dimensions to it, which I do not have scheduled to hit in this section that we're doing. But I've talked with Michael, maybe next spring we may take a Sunday morning to talk about the economics, the economic system we live in and our daily habits and how those are connected and how consumerism works with us and the spiritual components of that. Rich Christians in a World of Hunger by Ron Sider, who recently just passed away. A very influential book and affected people a lot. The other thing you can do is go live in Africa for 6 years. That's what Elisa and I say a lot of times. It'll have a big impact on you. You at least come away with all these questions like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? how am I supposed to live? But reading a good book can help too. So, all right. Any other last questions, comments? Thank you very much for those observations and excellent sort of connections to these basic building block things we have in our daily food is connected to all these other sort of things, which is, I think, one of the main reasons it's considered a capital vice. Let me close with a word of prayer. Father, we pray that you would help us to take what we have thought about here and how you in your grace have helped us maybe to think about things, understand things a little bit better here, this practical wisdom, and may we use it as we go out from here in ways to build to become more Christ-like in other areas of our life. We thank you and praise you that we can now go to worship and receive your grace in other sort of ways. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much.